April 30th, 1945, the small town of Bernier, outside what remained of Hamburg. Greta Hoffmann's skeletal hand trembled as the young American soldier pressed something wrapped in brown paper into her palm. She was 24 years old but looked twice that age, her face hollowed by 3 years of starvation rations, her body weighing barely 95 pounds. The soldier couldn't have been more than 19, with kind eyes that seemed too young to have witnessed what he had surely seen. He smiled at her, said something she couldn't understand in English, and walked away before she could process what had happened. When she unwrapped the paper, tears began streaming down her sunken cheeks. A Hershey's chocolate bar, whole and perfect, more than she had seen in 6 years of war. Around her, other women stood frozen in similar states of disbelief, clutching their own gifts from these foreign soldiers who should have been their enemies, holding treasures that Nazi propaganda had sworn would never exist in the starving, collapsing wasteland that was supposed to be America. What these German women didn't understand in that moment was that they were witnessing the psychological weapon that would prove more powerful than any bomb dropped on their cities. The simple act of enemy soldiers sharing abundance with a defeated population would fundamentally reshape how an entire generation understood power, prosperity, and the true cost of the ideology that had destroyed their nation. These weren't prisoners of war in the traditional sense. Germany hadn't deployed women as combat soldiers, though thousands had served as concentration camp guards, factory workers, and auxiliary personnel. But in the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed into rubble and ash, every German woman became a prisoner of different kind, trapped in a nightmare of starvation, destruction, and the terrible reckoning of what their nation had become. The collapse had been swift and total. By April 1945, German cities existed only as moonscapes of shattered stone. Berlin, Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne had been bombed into apocalyptic ruins. The vaunted 1,000-year Reich lay in smoking fragments after just 12 years, but it was the hunger that defined those final months, a gnawing, constant companion that drove women to unimaginable acts of desperation. The official ration for German civilians in early 1945 provided roughly 1,000 calories from Munich, kept a diary through those final terrible months. Her entries captured the daily degradation of survival. March 15th, 1945. Today I traded my wedding ring for 3 pounds of turnips and a cup of grain. The jeweller, a man who once sold pieces worth thousands of marks, wept as he made the exchange. Not for sentiment, but because even gold means nothing when there is no food to buy. My daughter, 9 years old, no longer cries from hunger. This terrifies me more than her tears ever did. She has learned that crying wastes energy we cannot afford. The systematic starvation was both consequence and continuation of Nazi policy. For years, Germany had fed itself by plundering occupied territories, draining France, Poland, Ukraine, and dozens of other nations to maintain German tables. Now, with those territories liberated and Allied forces advancing from all sides, the chickens had come home to roost. Germans were experiencing the same starvation they had inflicted on millions of others, though few made that connection in their desperate present. When American forces began arriving in German towns and cities in the spring of 1945, the soldiers encountered scenes that shocked even combat-hardened veterans. Women and children with hollow eyes and protruding bones, looking more like concentration camp survivors than enemy civilians. Private James Macaulay of the 3rd Armoured Division wrote home about his first encounter with German civilians in the town of Eschweiler. "Ma, I thought I was prepared for anything after what we saw at those camps. But seeing German women and kids who looked just as starved hit different. These weren't soldiers or guards. They were just people who'd been living on turnip soup and sawdust bread for years. There was this woman, probably only 30 but looked 60, who tried to dig through our garbage for food scraps. Captain ordered us to start sharing rations, said we were liberators, not conquerors, even though these folks had supported the regime that tried to kill us all. The order to share came from the top, though it contradicted official non-fraternization policies that strictly forbade American soldiers from interacting with German civilians. General Dwight Eisenhower himself had issued stern directives, warning troops not to be starving German civilians. They were miracles made tangible. The first encounters followed a pattern that repeated itself in hundreds of towns across the American occupation zone. Children would gather around American soldiers, initially wary, then emboldened by desperation. They had learned a few English words from somewhere, chocolate chief among them. The soldiers, despite orders not to fraternize, would pull bars from their pockets and hand them out. Then they would see the mothers watching from doorways and windows, too proud or too afraid to beg directly, but with eyes that betrayed the same desperate hunger. And the soldiers, being human despite the inhumanity they had witnessed, would share with them too. Anna Schmidt was 17 when American forces entered her village outside Heidelberg in late March 1945. She had been working in a munitions factory since age 14, 12 hours a day, on rations barely sufficient to keep workers alive. Her father had died on the Eastern Front in 1943. Her two brothers had disappeared somewhere in France after D-Day. Her mother was bedridden with tuberculosis, a disease that had become epidemic as malnutrition destroyed immune systems across Germany. Anna remembered the day with crystal clarity 6 decades later when interviewed for an oral history project. I was coming back from the factory. We hadn't been paid in weeks, not that money bought anything anyway. The Americans had entered the town that morning, and we had been told to stay inside, that they would rape and murder us all. But I had to get home to my mother. I was so frightened, walking through the streets with these foreign soldiers everywhere. Then one of them called out to me. I froze, certain this was the moment I would be attacked. But he just walked over and handed me something, a chocolate bar, a whole chocolate bar. I stared at it, unable to understand. He was smiling. Why was he smiling at me? We were the enemy. I had been making bullets to kill soldiers like him just that morning. But he just tipped his helmet, said something I didn't understand, and walked away. I stood there in the street and ate the entire bar right there, breaking off pieces and letting them melt in my mouth. I hadn't tasted chocolate since before the war. I didn't even save any for my mother. I am ashamed of that to this day, but I couldn't help myself. And I understood in that moment that everything we had been told about Americans was a lie. Minecraft became a collections for the war effort, led rallies celebrating German victories, turned in neighbours suspected of defeatist talk. When the Americans came to her town of Augsburg, she expected to be arrested or worse. Instead, a black American soldier found her and her 2 daughters huddled in the basement of their bombed-out building. She had never seen a black person before, and Nazi propaganda had filled her head with monstrous caricatures. The soldier took one look at her daughters, thin as ghosts and covered in dust, and called to his unit. Within minutes they had brought blankets, canned food, and an entire box of chocolate bars. I could not reconcile what I was seeing with what I had been taught, Margarita wrote in a memoir published in 1972. This man, whom I had been told was subhuman, was treating my daughters with more kindness than our own government had shown in years. He sat with us while we ate, made sure we had water, even found a medic to look at my younger daughter's infected cut, and he gave us chocolate. So much chocolate. The girls had forgotten what it tasted like. I watched them eat with such joy on their faces, the first joy I had seen in years, and I wept. Not from gratitude, though I felt that too. I wept from shame. Shame at what I had believed, what I had supported, what I had helped create. This American soldier had shown me more humanity in 10 minutes than the 1,000-year Reich had shown us in 12 years. The systematic distribution of American rations to German civilians began somewhat by accident, but quickly became unofficial policy. Junior officers in the field recognized that feeding the population served both humanitarian and strategic purposes. Starving, desperate people became a security problem, susceptible to disease, unrest, and potentially guerrilla resistance. Fed people were peaceful people, and America had food to spare. The sheer abundance available to American forces made the decision easier. While German civilians scraped by on turnip soup and sawdust bread, American mess halls routinely threw away more food than entire German villages received in a week. Soldiers ate 3 full meals daily, with meat at every meal, fresh bread, vegetables, coffee with real sugar, and desserts. Their K rations alone provided more calories than most Germans saw in 3 days. This information Robert Henshaw, a supply officer with the 7th Army, documented the waste in reports that later caused him profound. Chocolate specifically became symbolic beyond its caloric value. It was candy, a luxury, a treat that existed outside the realm of survival rations. In giving chocolate rather than just bread or soup, American soldiers were making a statement. We have so much that we can afford to give you luxuries, not just sustenance. It was the same psychological warfare that had worked on German POWs in American camps, but concentrated and immediate. The impact on individual women was profound and lasting. Helena Wagner was 19 when American forces liberated Dachau, where she had been held not as a prisoner, but as a civilian trapped in the town during the final, chaotic weeks of the war. She witnessed the liberation of the concentration camp, saw the walking skeletons emerge from those gates, understood for the first time the full scope of what her nation had done. She also saw American soldiers weeping openly at what they found, saw them sharing their rations with the survivors, saw them execute some of the SS guards in rage and anguish. That evening, as she tried to make her way home through the ruins, she encountered a group of American soldiers. She was terrified, certain they would exact revenge on any German they found. Instead, they offered her a ride in their truck, gave her a blanket, and shared their meal. One young soldier gave her 3 chocolate bars to take home to her family. Immigration, I tried to explain to him that I didn't know, Helena said in an interview 5 decades later, that we hadn't known about the camps, about what was being done. He just looked at me with these old eyes in his young face and said, "Now you know." Then he gave me the chocolate anyway. That destroyed me more than anything else could have. If he had been cruel, if he had hated me, I could have borne it. But his kindness, after what he had seen that day, his ability to still see me as human despite what my people had done, it broke something in me. I ate that chocolate, and I tasted my own complicity in every bite. The occupying American forces formally lifted the non-fraternization ban in June 1945, acknowledging what everyone already knew. The policy was unenforceable and counterproductive. Soldiers were already sharing food, helping rebuild homes, and yes, developing romantic relationships with German women. The so-called war bride early months of occupation, through countless small acts of kindness, chocolate bars passed from victor to vanquished. Dr. Elisabeth Noelle Neumann, who would later become one of Germany's most prominent political scientists and pollsters, conducted early surveys of German civilians in the summer of 1945. Her findings revealed the chocolate's impact. 78% of German women interviewed reported direct positive interactions with American soldiers, most involving shared food. 62% specifically mentioned chocolate as a symbol of American generosity. When asked to describe their impressions of Americans before and after occupation, the contrast was stark. Before occupation, common words were barbaric, uncivilized, inferior. After just 2 months of American presence, responses shifted to generous, friendly, wealthy, kind. Immigration unmade our propaganda faster than any re-education program could have, Noelle Neumann wrote in her analysis. How do you maintain belief in German superiority and American degeneracy when American soldiers are feeding your children? How do you cling to Nazi ideology when enemy troops treat you better than your own government ever did? The chocolate was small, but its impact was enormous. It represented a truth our people needed to face. We had been wrong about everything. The contrast with Soviet occupation in Eastern Germany made the American chocolate diplomacy even more powerful. Soviet forces, having suffered unimaginable losses at German hands during Operation Barbarossa, arrived in Germany with understandable rage and thirst for vengeance. Rape, looting, and brutality were common in the Soviet zones. German women who found themselves in American zones often considered themselves lucky, a sentiment that reinforced Cold War divisions that would last decades. Miento's Maria Steinfeld experienced both occupation forces. Her town of Erfurt fell to American forces initially in April 1945, then was handed over to Soviet control as part of the post-war division of Germany. She experienced the difference directly. The Americans gave us chocolate and helped rebuild. The Russians took everything that wasn't nailed down, and much that was. I don't say this to excuse what Germany did to Russia. We earned their hatred. But the Americans, who had every right to hate us too, chose generosity instead. That choice changed everything. By the time the Russians took over our town, we had already learned what democracy looked like. Starvation and abuse, often couldn't digest the rich chocolates without getting sick. Army doctors quickly learned to distribute the candy carefully, in small portions, as liberated prisoners' bodies adjusted to normal food again. Rosa Goldberg survived Auschwitz and was on a death march when American forces intercepted her column in late April 1945. She weighed 78 pounds and could barely walk. An American medic carried her to an ambulance, where a nurse gave her small pieces of chocolate dissolved in warm milk. I thought I had died, and this was heaven, Rosa remembered. Chocolate milk. In hell, we had dreamed of bread and water. This was beyond dreaming. The nurse kept saying things I didn't understand yet, but her tone was so gentle. She was crying while she fed me. I didn't understand why she was crying until later. She was crying because she saw what had been done to us, to me. That chocolate milk was the first food I had eaten in 2 weeks that wasn't given to me by someone who wanted me dead. Imprisoned military's casual abundance was most visible in the formation of the occupying forces' logistics system. The United States Army in Germany received regular shipments of supplies that dwarfed anything the German military had managed, even at the height of its power. Chocolate factories in Hershey, Pennsylvania, produced thousands of tons monthly specifically for military use. The Quartermaster Corps distributed these supplies efficiently across the entire occupation zone. German women who took jobs working for American forces in administrative roles, mess halls or laundries, witnessed this abundance firsthand. They saw waste that would have fed entire German families, supplies delivered with such regularity that running out of any item was virtually impossible, and a system so efficient it made German legendary organization look amateurish by comparison. Crimson Hartmann was hired to work in an American mess hall in Frankfurt in July 1945. She was a trained chef who had worked in a fine restaurant before the war. Her perspective on American food culture was colored by professional experience. I had been taught that German cuisine was superior, that Americans were unsophisticated in matters of food and culture. Then I worked in their mess hall and learned how wrong I had been. Yes, the food was simpler than what I had prepared in the restaurant, but the abundance, the quality, the variety. I watched them prepare breakfast for 300 men and throw away more food in one morning than my restaurant had served in a week before rationing began. And the chocolate. They were lost to a civilization that operated on a completely different scale than our own. The Berlin airlift in 1948 would crystallize this chocolate diplomacy into an iconic moment. When Soviet forces blockaded West Berlin, cutting off road and rail access, the United States responded with a massive airlift that kept the city supplied entirely by air for nearly a year. Lieutenant Gail Halverson, an Air Force pilot, began dropping chocolate bars attached to small parachutes for children watching the planes land at Tempelhof Airport. The program, nicknamed Operation Little Victuals, eventually dropped over 21 tons of chocolate and candy over Berlin. German women whose children caught those candy parachutes understood the message clearly. America could not only feed them despite Soviet blockade, it could afford to drop candy from the sky for fun. This was power beyond military might, abundance that made blockades irrelevant. Jiang 1950, as the Marshall Plan rebuilt German infrastructure and the Wirtschaftswunder economic miracle began to take hold, chocolate had returned to German stores. German women could buy Hershey bars with Deutschmarks earned in the new economy. But those who had received their first post-war chocolate from American soldiers never forgot that moment of contact between victor and vanquished, when young men who should have been enemies chose to be human instead. Dr. Gudrun Fischer, a sociologist who studied post-war German society, interviewed hundreds of women for her 1968 book, Schokolade und Frieden, Chocolate and Peace. Her findings revealed patterns that persisted across generations. Women who had positive encounters with American soldiers during occupation were significantly more likely to support democratic reforms, embrace American culture, and reject nationalist movements. Their children grew up hearing stories not of defeat and humiliation, but of unexpected kindness from unexpected sources. The chocolate had planted seeds of transformation that would bloom into the stable, democratic, prosperous West Germany that became America's staunchest Cold War ally. Crimson, my mother never let us waste chocolate, one woman told Fisher. Even years later, when we could afford as much as we wanted, she treated it with reverence. She would tell us about the American soldier who gave her a Hershey bar in the ruins of Hamburg, how she had hidden half of it to make it last, how she had cried when she finally ate the last piece because it meant her connection to that moment of grace was gone. Bergen-Belsen received no chocolate. They were arrested, tried, and many were executed for their crimes. The contrast was deliberate and profound. American soldiers could distinguish between ordinary women who had lived under an evil system and those who had actively participated in its atrocities. The chocolate went to the hungry, the innocent, the victims. The guilty faced justice. This moral clarity impressed many Germans who watched the occupation unfold. Irma Grazer, the infamous beautiful beast of Belsen, was hanged at age 22 for her crimes. Herta Botha, another Ravensbrück guard, received 10 years in prison. When asked if she felt the Americans had treated her fairly, Botha responded in 1971, "The Americans were more fair than I deserved. I saw them giving chocolate to the women I had guarded, women I had struck and abused. They showed those women more kindness in one day than I had shown them in years. That taught me more about the difference between right and wrong than any court sentence could. I deserved worse than I received." Lanz Chocolate and German Women in 1945 is ultimately a story about the power of small gestures to change history. No grand treaty, no formal reparations program, no denazification lecture accomplished what those chocolate bars accomplished. They made real, tangible, and undeniable the difference between the society that had waged total war and the society that chose to feed its defeated enemies. The women who received that chocolate became ambassadors of a truth their nation needed to learn. They raised children who grew up hearing that Americans weren't monsters, but liberators, that democracy wasn't weakness, but strength, that abundance came from production rather than conquest. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, many elderly German women stood in the crowds waving to American troops, some holding signs that read, "Danke für die Schokolade," "Thank you for the chocolate." They were thanking those long-ago soldiers who had seen their humanity when they were at their lowest, who had shared sweetness in a bitter time, who had chosen kindness over vengeance, and in doing so had helped rebuild not just buildings and roads, but souls and societies. The chocolate was just chocolate. Brown squares wrapped in brown paper, mass-produced in Pennsylvania factories and shipped across an ocean. But in the hands of German women who had known only attached, the seeds of modern Germany were planted and began, slowly, determinedly, miraculously, to grow.